Hello, my name is Paul Zanazanian, and welcome to History in the Now Conversations, a podcast on history and how we use it in our everyday lives. History in the Now Conversations explores how we use history to know who we are, to know how to think and feel, and to know how to engage in our daily routines. History in the Now Conversations examines what history is, what it does, and how we can use it or even should use it in our everyday lives. Today's guest is Dwayne Donald. Dwayne is a descendant of Norwegian, Metis, and amiskwaciwiyiniwak ancestors, Beaver Hills Cree. He works as a professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta. He is also a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Reimagining Teacher Education with Indigenous Wisdom Traditions. His work focuses on unlearning colonialism and experimenting with the ways in which Indigenous wisdom traditions can expand and enhance understanding of curriculum and pedagogy. Dwayne, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
I'd like to take a moment to mention that McGill is located in Tiohtià:ke, also known as Montreal, in the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Hakka Mohawk peoples of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I would like to thank and honor Montreal's original inhabitants. Dwayne, an important part of your work focuses on developing pedagogy around walking as a life practice, which I find very fascinating and which a lot of people across Canada, Turtle Island, find very fascinating as well. Could you please tell us a little more about what you do?
I think the best way to try to explain my relationship to walking is to begin by saying that as a human being for most of my life, I've been someone who likes to move. I was a runner. I was one of those crazy people who ran like 100 kilometers a week when I was younger, stuff like that. And, when I got older and I started doctoral studies, as with most of us, we have a lot of questions that keep us awake at night. And at that time, I was struggling with a lot of identity, misunderstandings. And I had, a provocation from someone you may have heard of named Leroy Littlebear, who is an eminent Blackfoot scholar. And I was at a session, and he said that, you have an identity problem when the land doesn't recognize you. And I felt like he was speaking directly to me. So what I started doing, this is over 20 years ago now, is I started walking beside the beautiful river we have in Edmonton, Amiskwaciwiyiniwak. It's the river that flows at a swift walking pace. And I was drawn to the river now, I understand it as I was drawn to the river by a desire to heal myself, almost like make a transformation in who I was and how I thought of myself in relation to the work I was interested in, which of course is curriculum and pedagogy. And I found that the more I walked, the more my mind was animated by stories and memories and experiences. And they started to come to me in kind of a layered way. And through that practice, I developed a relationship with walking that helped me understand that I need to move in order to think in the ways I find most creative, most productive, I guess you could say. And so it's become habitual for me now. If I'm stuck as a writer, or if there's something I'm puzzling on that I need to attend to, I'll go for a walk. And it's a life practice that I carry on with. And probably about 20 years ago, I decided to share it with some undergraduate students that I was working with. I just took a chance. It was a beautiful day, and I took them down in the river valley and shared with them the stories I had been thinking about. And now it's quite well known in Edmonton and area. Before COVID, I probably did 90 of those river valley walks. It's a 2-hour kind of walk. So it's become a big part of who I am as an educator.
It's really interesting. How nervous were you when you decided to take your students out for the first time?
I don't recall being real nervous. I think probably because I had told myself those stories so many times before I shared that it just seemed like the right thing to do. And I think maybe an important thing to also mention is that part of my interest in walking as an educator is just a desire to connect with people beyond the intellect, to address their bodies, their emotion, their spirit. And I think being outside beside the river gives me an opportunity to do that in just a little bit, so they know what it feels like.
Is it like a form of meditation?
It can be. It does involve, I do try to share, I guess I would call them cosmological understandings, deep time understandings of that place and the wisdom that's existed at that place for a long time. Some people might experience as meditative, but there isn't really a time when we stop to meditate. It's more about, for me, touching the water, paying attention to the trees, those kinds of things, sort of a sacred ecology kind of connection.
And how did your work take off and gain a lot of recognition?
Well, certainly for the teachers in the Edmonton area, it became a very popular PD item and continues to be. Teachers have a full day PD, and when the weather's nice, I'm often in the River Valley with 40, 50 teachers from particular schools. And when I think about it, it's literally thousands of people in the Edmonton area that I've had a chance to speak to. And yeah, it's just not the same kind of contact that you would get if you only relied on academic conferences or writing papers, right? It's a different kind of connection. So it feels really good to be able to guide people in those ways.
And what kind of results do you see, if we can use the term results?
Well, I think there's a curiosity that many people have, that they realize that there's a lot they haven't been told. And one of my critiques, I guess, of our faculties of education, our teacher education programs in general, is that when they do address Indigenous themes and issues, it's mostly information about those people. And I think a lot of educators are really desperate's probably too strong of a word, but they feel that there's a need for them to learn differently, to be taught differently. And they get that with the River Valley Walk, which you wouldn't get with, like I said, a keynote or a PowerPoint presentation. It's just not the same experience.
And when you have teachers who practice the pedagogy on their own, is it hard for them to...
Yeah.
So, okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's often the question I get is, I'm not Indigenous. I don't want to be accused of cultural appropriation. I can't do what you do. How do you think, And so my advice is to most of the people is just try to keep it simple. Just understand that all people enjoy being outside, and you don't need to overmanage it. You just need to give them a chance to be outside and give them a few things to think about, right? And that's about it. So that's usually where the awkwardness gets, is how what I've shared could be transitioned to what they might do with their own students, right?
And how were you able to be able to think like this? I'm sure at first it must have been really hard for people to make mistakes or to use your pedagogy in a way that wasn't necessarily intended for it. But I guess over time you've learned to accept, or how was that process?
I was a high school social studies teacher for 10 years at a place called Kainai High School. And the Kainai First Nation is in southern Alberta, almost to the Montana border. And they're Blackfoot people. And so for those 10 years, I was initiated, I would say, into a beginner's understanding of Blackfoot understanding of themselves in relation to the place where they've lived for thousands of years. And so one of the experiences I had there as a teacher in the community was being taken to sacred sites and understanding how Blackfoot people can map their territory according to stories and songs. And so these sacred sites, I witnessed how they are approached as living relatives. And I witnessed how to honor the life that's there, right? And I'm not a Blackfoot person, right? My most of my ancestry is in central Alberta, Cree, or we say Beaver Hills, amiskwaciwiyiniwak. So it's not the same, but as with a lot of Indigenous people, there are shared understandings. And so I would say the sacredness of places, how to approach a place as a living relative, these were all, I guess I could call them pedagogical sensibilities that I was introduced to with Blackfoot folks. And so when I went back home to Edmonton, I was so inspired by this that I just wanted to figure out, how can I carry on with this? And so lucky for me, for the last 25 years or so, I've had the chance to learn more deeply how Amiskwaciwiyiniwak Cree people in the area I'm from, how they do that too, right? And so I've just tried to take a little bit of that and help my students have a chance to also experience that, right? Because it was so important to me. I want that for them too.
It's really interesting. And then now that you do research, how are you able to connect? Because there's a switch happening, right? You're using a different knowledge system or a different state of being.
That's right.
And then you have to somehow translate it into science, quote unquote, like Western science, I'm assuming? Or are you able to change all that and do your own thing? Like, how does it work when it comes to research?
Well, right now, the research we're engaged in involves cohorts of teachers from 4 school districts or boards, 2 in Alberta, 1 in BC, and 1 in Quebec. And what we're taking the cohort teachers through at each site is a 5-year inquiry process where we have them for 4 full days each year. Basically, we're trying to understand what is necessary in teacher education for the next step in engagement with Indigenous knowledge and insight beyond the required course, which all faculties of education in Canada have now. So you have this initial introduction to information about Indigenous people, but my view is that information doesn't go very far. It's necessary, but if you want the kind of transformation that I do, then you understand that if people are expected to teach differently, they have to be taught differently. And so what we're experimenting with in the different cohort areas are, first of all, engagements with colonial history in the local area, a lot of things that they don't know, they've never been told, and taking it up in a past, present, future kind of a way, in sort of a willingness to study colonial culture and its presence in their lives, in their work, in the curriculum documents that they're expected to follow. And then the next, I guess, part of what we call unlearning colonialism is what we call paradigmatic provocations. So it's sustained, repeated opportunities for people to be taught according to wisdom traditions in the area where they live and work. And so to be led by Indigenous folks, to be guided, for example, to go to sacred sites or to participate in ceremonies. And so these paradigmatic provocations, it's obviously opportunities for them to be taught in ways that are unfamiliar to them. And the other thing is, eventually what we do, Paul, is we're going to introduce wisdom concepts in the local languages and connect people with those as best we can, because translation is always kind of limited. And then use all that to ask them to begin to imagine what they might do in their own classroom. So like you said, it's always back to science or back to social studies or back to English or math. And so it's just an experiment, really, as a researcher, I feel, an experiment to see if you support people, educators in this way, what can they actually do in the classroom that's going to matter and be sustainable. It's not just a one-event thing. And so we're just finishing year 2. And we're going slow.
Yeah.
But so far, some really good things are happening.
Sounds very exciting and promising too.
Mm-hmm.
Does the idea of reflexivity or the notion of reflexivity come into play at all? Or is it not as central to the learning process?
I think it does, for sure. But one thing that is a really big part of my practice personally is to think that this idea of wisdom exists all around the world. This is how I've been mentored. And that those people back then actually knew quite a bit about life and how to live well. And although our lives have changed a lot, my view is that part of our challenge is to reach back to those traditions and try to make sense of them today. So that's a long way of saying that reflexivity for me mostly involves a winter count practice, which is something that was very common in the prairies before things changed. So the way I could explain it in the most direct way is that, like most human communities, there's a desire to remember important events. And so in the prairie communities, like the Blackfoot or the Cree, there was a person who was designated as this person who would decide what was important to remember. And a lot of times this would involve consultation, but this was typically done in the winter when people were inside trying to stay warm and just looking to survive. And so eventually, once the decision was made about what the one or two or sometimes three events were for the past trip around the sun, symbols would be made, and they would be painted on buffalo robes. And so in some cases, of course, it depends on the size of the robe, but you could have 70 or 80 symbols in ever-widening circle. And so these are mnemonic devices that were used traditionally. And the way it was explained to me is you can imagine people inside on a cold day, someone rolls out one of these robes and you can point at the symbol and it triggers the memory or the story of that event. So I was so inspired by this that I use it now in all of my classes. So I ask students to make a symbol for each week of the course. And the symbol is to express what was most meaningful for them from that week. And it could be something as simple as something a classmate said, something I said, something they read, something that occurred to them while they were going home on the bus. And so we do the same thing with the research process. The research participants are asked to make symbols. And so that's maybe not reflexive in ways you may be thinking, but I've just found that it's a really powerful way for people to connect with what they found meaningful.
In my understanding, it feels like there's a form of repetition, but it's expansion through repetition because there's no boundary that points you into a certain direction. It feels like you can repeat but expand.
Yeah. Every year that I do it, I'm continuously inspired by how creative people will be if you give them the confidence and they trust you that they actually can be creative. And you would think in an undergrad class on Indigenous curriculum and pedagogy that you would get symbols that are very similar, but I don't. They're very unique, and some people make sculptures with snow, some people draw, some people paint, some people sew, some people make beads or beading patterns. It's really a remarkable pedagogical approach, and I can't take much credit for it because I really don't do anything but ask them to do it. Mm-hmm. So I think the wisdom is in the process. That's what inspires me.
And you seek positive reactions to it.
Mm-hmm.
One last question before we move on to history. Do you have an end goal? What would you like to see happen with your work in the long run?
Where I'm from, we have an act of love called Treaty 6. And, across the country, there's different understandings of treaty and its significance. But for us, in our tradition, that agreement is taken very seriously. And one of the reasons is that the people back then blessed or sanctified that agreement with their pipes. And so we have that inheritance. But as most people know, treaties have been a massive curricular omission in this country. And so if people understand treaty at all, it's usually the contract version, the government version, and the idea of ceding and surrendering land. But for us, it's an adoption ceremony. That's what we were told. And so My vision is to honor that idea of kinship. And it's a more than human agreement as well, right? It involves all the life around us. And so when I think about all the troubles we have in the world today, every generation faces their troubles. I see it as a prolonged struggle with relationship denial in many different forms. We're caught up in a legacy of relationship denial and kind of its normalization and naturalization. And so if I want to try to help people recover from that, then the most important thing to do is to honor relationships. And that's what kinship is about. And so the vision is to honor that treaty idea that we're meant to look after each other, we're meant to care for each other, we're meant to learn from each other, and we're meant to operate ourselves as human beings in ways that don't bring harm, that enhance well-being. And that's in our language we say amiskwaciwiyiniwak, amiskwaciwiyiniwak, which is all about that. It's about good relationships. And so, whenever someone asks me, what are you up to? I point to that treaty handshake, and I think it's as simple as that, but also a very complex thing. But I think what I've learned over the years is that kind of idea of humans getting along better is fairly easy for a lot of people to think about or understand as a goal, but the more than human connection, right? And so, what I've been taught is if the river is unhealthy and polluted, then human relationships will also be unhealthy and polluted. So our deliberations have to include the life around us.
It's very interesting. I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago when we last spoke, I was questioning whether humans were innately good or good and evil at the same time. And then I remember you told me humans are innately good. and now when you're talking like this, it made me think of that moment. And I was wondering if you want to expand a little, because we didn't have much time back then. Does being innately good connect to what you say when you talk about kinship and pointing to Treaty 6?
It's a very delicate issue that you raise, for sure. And I think what I want to say on that, Paul, is that, so I spent a lot of time with this beautiful old man. Some people would call him an elder. We use the word kiiteya, which means a kind-hearted one, but he's 81. His name's Bob Cardinal, and he's a spiritual leader in our area. He's a healer. And I've just learned so much from him and how he tries to look after people. But I would say there's always this flexic understanding of what we might say good and bad, to simplify things. But what I've observed with the old man is that part of the gifts that people like him have is the way to align ourselves with goodness. And that's his role. He brings people together. He has that ability to align people with goodness. And maybe I'll say that all people can be aligned with goodness if they wish, if they're open to that, right? It's almost like going to the chiropractor and getting adjusted. So we can get distracted, for sure. But I think that's something that's missing from a lot of people's lives, is that opportunity to be part of ceremony or ritual, whatever it is, that aligns them. And I just, in my work, I've noticed that it's very emotional for people who maybe, let's say they aren't Indigenous, but yet they're invited to participate. It's very emotional for a lot of people to have a chance to be part of a ceremony, or even just to do something every day like smudge, or, So I guess I've just learned, in the role that I have, to take that seriously, that people need that.
Very interesting. Thank you, Dwayne.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk history.
Okay, I'm ready.
So what's the first idea or image that comes to mind when you think of history? And why do you think that image comes to mind?
It's a very interesting question. And I think what I want to share is at the University of Alberta, we have an old library, and there's a reading room on the second floor. And there was a mural painted right on the wall of that reading room. It's quite large. And the title was Alberta History. It was painted there in 1951 by a retired arts professor named Edward Glyde. Alberta History. The mural is packed full of human beings in the surrounding scene of the Edmonton River Valley. And every single iconic, mythological part of the settlement of the prairies in the last 150 years is present in that mural. You see Fort Edmonton, you see teepees, you see York boats, you see Northwest Mounted Police, you see missionaries, and you see half-dressed Indians. And it's packed full of all of these really problematic understandings of Alberta history. And so, as you might guess, it's a contentious mural. There's been petitions to have it removed or painted over. But the reason I've thought of that is that about 15 years ago, the university received a painting by a pretty well-known Dene artist, the late Alex Janvier, who some listeners might recognize his name. But he had a painting that was installed opposite Alberta history at about the same height. And Alex Janvier's work he titled it Sky Talk. And what it is, it's beautiful, layered, very colorful sky to earth and subterranean view. And a human being is arising out of the earth from the layers and is reaching for the sky. And that's all you see. And I think right there in that face-off depicts most of the tensions and the difficulties we face in recognizing that something called Alberta history, which pretends to be able to say with authority that before the forts arrived in the area where I'm from, nothing important happened there. History didn't begin until the forts arrived. These were people who lived without history. A very anthropocentric view and a very colonial exploitation, all the things that people continue to be troubled by. But on the other side, we have this very different view of history. A history that cannot just include humans. Has to include the relationship between the earth and the sky and the ways humans are cradled between them and all the layers that exist in the earth and the sky as a beginning. And I think, if we take that up in terms of stories we tell about the world and our place in it, that the tension between Canadian and Indigenous is depicted right there in that. You could call it that phenomenological space of being in between, stuck between stories, right? And I think that's a good way to describe the relationship that Indigenous, worldview has in faculties of education now, that particular tension. So that might be the most provocative thoughts I have of history when you ask me that question.
That's interesting. One thought that came to mind was how difficult it must be to be confronted with the perpetrator or their descendants on a daily basis. My background comes from a traumatic background as well, but I live in a diasporic community and I don't get to face, the other that still kind of looks down.
Right.
So it's hard.
Yeah, it is hard, but I guess what I've learned is, if we use that phrase, truth and reconciliation, in my, opportunities to travel around the country and meet different Indigenous people in different communities, there's very few that find much value in reconciliation. They don't really see it as something that concerns them. A lot of people say that's for Canadians. That's for them. And so that leaves truth. And, a lot of our institutions in Canada, they champion reconciliation, but we don't actually talk about truth. And, my view is that it's really important. I'm happy that the schools have been addressed, the residential schools, all the trauma and all the trouble. But there's a lot more colonial oppression that's happened that people don't know. And so, in a certain sense, we can't ignore that story. We have to go through it in order to heal. And that's part of the unlearning colonialism process that we're investigating, is this engagement with the ongoingness of colonial culture. And so, I think that mural is helpful in that way. And if people are guided in the ways they should be, right?
Very interesting. Thank you. So you talked about the first idea or image that comes to mind. Could you now perhaps talk a little bit about your earliest memory of your connection to history, going way back when?
It is interesting to puzzle on, like, how you would be aware that history was happening. Like, these sort of, it's one thing to have an event or an experience. It's one thing to understand it as historical in some way. It's another very interesting question. What comes to mind? I'll go with that. What came to mind first is, I don't know how old I was. I would think I was probably about 4 years old. But I was going to what I guess we would call play school, for like an afternoon kind of thing at a local community hall in Edmonton. And I can picture we were in front of kind of a industrial-sized sink in this community hall, and the tap was running, and there was one of the adults that was there, I don't know who she was scrubbing my hands with like a really abrasive scrub brush and washing my hands. And this went on. I can't recall how often, but I do remember that my mother asked me, like, what happened to your hands, right? Because they were kind of raw and red. And it stopped after that, right? So I assume our mother went and said, what is going on? And so I've thought about, what that woman was attempting to do, and the only thing I can think of is that she thought I was dirty and was trying to somehow clean me up. I mean, my hands are darker, I guess, than she was used to, but just the idea that as an Indigenous person that I was just naturally, inherently dirty, I think is probably what was going on there in the late 60s in Edmonton. So, of course I can't say for sure what was going through my mind, but I guess what I would say is there's sort of an awareness that something is going on that you don't fully understand, that was going on before you arrived. That might be one way for me to try to explain the historical nature of that memory.
Do you have any scars or physical?
No, it didn't go on that long, but my mother noticed.
And you remember it.
Yeah.
So it's still part of your own heritage, like you're...
Right. Yeah.
Interesting. Please describe a moment in time, an incident or an episode in your professional life or in your everyday life where you had to justify the importance of using history for attaining a goal or making some kind of change through your work. What was your justification for using history?
I was once tasked with visiting, in our Faculty of Education, visiting most of the curriculum courses that were going on as sort of a guest speaker. This is before Indigenous themes and issues were more prominent in curriculum documents across the country. So my job was to, almost felt like being a used car salesman, where I would say, oh, well, here's this, it's not that bad, take it for a spin, kick the tires. I didn't enjoy it very much. I think it was just 1 year that I did that. But it was just to try and raise awareness and get the students' attention. And so I was with some students who were preparing to teach high school science, so biology, chemistry, history, or chemistry, physics. And there were a lot of them. There was probably 60 or 70 of them I was in front of. And I began by speaking Nihiawewen, like I introduced myself in Cree. And I was interrupted by a student who basically said, why are you speaking that language that none of us can understand? I could speak a language that no one understands, but what would be the point of that? Speak English. So, first of all, I was, of course, taken aback by how aggressively disrespectful he was and how that was okay for him, but also, there were some of the instructors in the room, and no one said anything. So, of course, I had to improvise. And so this is, I think, where this reliance on history came to the fore. And of course, I can't remember exactly what I said because I was in the midst of it and actually quite torn up by what had just happened. But I can remember trying to provide some context for why the language might matter and the ways in which it was specifically targeted to be destroyed, and the ways in which language holds wisdom, the ways in which language carries understandings that can actually be vital to our lives and our survival. And so I think I went on to talk about sacred understandings of life in the area that are available in the language. And I didn't have the impression that the person listening or the people listening were impressed, but that was my attempt to sort of, I guess you could say, give more depth to why I spoke the language in that setting. So that's one experience that comes to mind.
It's good that you stood up and spoke and you didn't recoil or change and give that person the satisfaction of getting his way.
Right, yeah.
I want to ask you what your definition of history is based on what you've said. But I'm wondering if your understanding of history, the way you've been talking about it, is one understanding of history as opposed to another understanding of history. Because history is, the term itself is like a Eurocentric, is a European, is a Western invention. And it's a Western concept of understanding prior times,
right,
and its impact for today. So I was wondering if me using the term history is an alien term, and then because you've grown up and have been socialized in the dominant culture as well as your own culture, you're able to address it.
We've started to use the phrase knowledge dexterity. And so I would say, my first degree was in history at the University of Alberta. So I have I would say, my own kind of passion for understanding that kind of history and see its value, what it offers us. But yeah, there is, I think one of the most challenging things to do, at least for me, I'll speak for myself, is to recognize the arbitrary nature of the categories and classifications of knowledge that come from the European tradition that have been universalized to the point where a lot of people can't actually imagine that there might be other ways, right? And so I haven't read your book, and we don't know each other very well, but my impression is that your understanding of history is that it's less of an academic discipline and more of an everyday experience that we have as human beings. And so it's a relationship that involves, for me, an amalgamation of the past, the present, and the future constantly. And so I don't think, the wisdom traditions that I'm interested in trying to honor in the work that I do don't have the same ways of classifying knowledge. And so when I say knowledge dexterity, it's this ability to recognize when some forms of knowledge are more appropriate than others, and you can adjust. And then your students can adjust as well. And so what I try to do is honor history, that tradition, in the European tradition way, because there is a lot of value in that. But of course, I think there's a mistake to think that every understanding of the past and the future and human significance with that has to conform to that model or those tenets, those principles. The benchmarks of historical thinking is a good example, right? And so I'm very interested in trying to understand better how, for example, the old people I spend time with, how they understand the significance of the past. And I would say it's in a sort of important way that the way in which Gadamer articulates effective historical consciousness is very similar to what our old people say, that you are caught up in a stream of tradition. And so it's very important for you to understand those inheritances and how they influence you and how they can guide you. And then there's always this idea that it's not just the span of your own lifetime. We're always taught to think into the future about what you're doing now, what that's going to mean, right? And so it's this constant amalgamation that I think I find so interesting. And that's my own kind of interpretation of what Gadamer had to say, right? That you are caught up in the flow. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what I mean by knowledge dexterity. When I teach, I try to honor those different ways together. But definitely try to help students understand that this false universalization causes a lot of trouble.
Yeah. The working definition in my book is that history is the interpretation of the movement of time. So,
very nice.
Thank you. So, having just said what you said, could you attempt to give us your authentic understanding of what you believe history is? I know it's a hard ask on the spot.
Yeah,
moment.
Might have to lay down for a while with that, but I don't know if I could provide a coherent definition, but I think what I want to say is that these days, for me, one of the biggest challenges I have is to recover from the human-centric understanding of that. And I want to take as seriously as I can all of the network of stories and relationships that comprise how life and living was understood before things changed, where my ancestry is quite deep. And so my definition of history would involve deep time, would involve cycles and patterns and stories about those and what those teach us. And then it's almost like there's a flowing together of human experiences as well. And so Thompson Highway had a little lecture that he provided, and there's a booklet that comes from that. I can't remember the title of it, but in that booklet, he identifies sort of genres of storytelling. Atsimoan in Nihiawiwan in the Cree language is truth-telling. So it's telling what happened as the person experienced it. Amiskwaciwiyiniwak is like fictionalizing, not intentional, but sometimes intentional, to deceive. But it's you're sort of making things up, sometimes teasing people in that way. Ateokiwin are sacred stories. And all of these they're held together as part of the human experience, right? And so that might be my best attempt to try to say it's not an attempt to ignore what we might consider recent history or Canadian history, but it's an attempt to always ground it in what's been going on for thousands and thousands of years before things changed.
The source.
Right.
Interesting. Because we can learn a lot about today by questioning and learning from the source or about the source.
I think so. And as you would know, there are people all around the world that tell stories that are very relevant to the problems we face today. So I rely a lot on those stories, and I try to share them with my students as much as I can, because I just think they're very valuable, very insightful.
So what you just offered would happen at an individual level, or does it go for a broader level, like more communal group level of understanding of history?
Yeah, I would think there's always this dynamic of the individual and the community and the individual. But I mean, that's the essence of a community in a sense, is a common memory, right? You have a shared kind of understanding as what has transpired before you, what's going on now, and some kind of shared vision for what the good life is in the future, right? So, but we each experience that in our own ways, right? I would say. And very much in the traditions that I'm trying to honor these days, there's an element of non-interference that's very strong, that you don't need to impose. The intention is to inspire rather than impose. So not everyone has to conform to those ways.
Who would the you be?
The you in...
Like as in, meaning you don't need to conform and non-interference.
Right.
I was
the
wondering,
you would be, I guess, the person who's learning.
Okay, so they don't need to impose on themselves.
Right, or be imposed on.
Okay, so it's just, okay, I get it.
Yeah.
So there's room for feeling and following one's instincts.
Right, working things out on your own. There's this idea that everybody has that right, I guess you could say, to try to find meaning in their own way. It doesn't need to be choreographed.
Very interesting. And based on what you've said, is this understanding of history a good thing, or could it also be a bad thing?
Well, I guess getting to the age that I'm at, things can always be bad. There seems to be a built-in struggle to sort out what stories to take seriously or how to understand them. I mean, I'm just thinking of the more than human again, and the ways in which so many people struggle for that to be considered valid or useful. Today, those are a lot of times just considered baby stories that people make up, when they have nothing else to do. And so there is, I think, that danger that sacred stories like the ones I'm thinking of can be misunderstood or misused for other means. But I can't really think of other ways it could go bad. I mean, I guess if it's united with who's right and who's wrong, that always leads to trouble, right? That our stories are more correct than yours. So there is that element of it as well.
Does that happen often?
Not in the circles where I hang out with, but it seems to be always a threat. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any final thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners?
Nothing really comes to mind. I think we've covered a lot of things. It's just that I really enjoyed just looking at this Mount Royal.
Yes, the view from the window.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah, I have a nice view.
It's beautiful, and it really historicizes. This. I was saying as we were driving in, you come to places like this. It's one of the reasons I love traveling. Is you check out the topography. You try to imagine. Before there was a big city here, what was it like?
Yes.
And I just think, here's this beautiful mountain. Here's this beautiful river. We'll stay here. Yeah, this is a good place. I could just imagine people thousands and thousands of years ago coming
Yeah.
here and saying, yeah, we'll stay here.
I don't know to what extent the mountains changed, but whenever I walk on the mountain, I'm like, I'm not sure if these trees were here a long time ago or if that row of trees are in their natural state of beingness. So, yeah, interesting. But it is a beautiful mountain.
Mm-hmm.
Dwayne Donald, thank you so much.
Thanks, Paul.